Welcome. Today I want to introduce you to FRAM, the Functional Resonance Analysis Method. It might sound quite heavy, quite formal, but really it's just about understanding how real work happens day to day and how both good and bad outcomes can come from the same underlying process. Before I start, I'd like you to watch a short introduction video by Dr. Marc Soujin and Dr. Dominique Furnis, who will look at why it's an important part of how we assure the safety of complex systems, including autonomous systems. So click on the link, turn up the volume, and rejoin me in about 4 minutes. FRAM was developed by Eric Hogenagel in 2004. Unlike traditional safety methods that start by looking for faults, FRAM focuses on how work is actually undertaken, what Hogenagel calls work as done. The idea is that system functions naturally vary, and when those variabilities interact, they can create both success and failure. So success and failure are seen as just two sides of the same coin. The mission of building a FRAM is simple but powerful. It helps us understand three key things: how something has been done in the past, how it's done today, and how it could be done in the future. And that way we can anticipate both the strengths and the vulnerabilities of the system that we care about and we're analysing. We're going to initially chat about the principles that underpin Eric's view before we look at the method. We're going to see how Eric's view of the world has finally been expressed through FRAM. The first principle is that success and failure emerge from the same underlying processes. When people adjust to conditions, whether expected or unexpected, the adjustments are always approximate, they're never perfect. Most of the time these approximations work just fine, but occasionally they miss the mark, and that's when what we call failure occurs. You will personally have experienced this. One day something works, the next day exactly the same thing does not work. You did exactly the same thing at the same time in the same way. What's changed is not you or your actions, but something that you're not aware of, the context that you cannot see. Work and environments are always underspecified. We all know that. They lack perfect detail. They lack predictability. Therefore, continuous adaptation is required at all levels, as individuals and teams and organizations. Such adaptations respond to changes in resources, to time, to tools, to information, to opportunities, to conflict, to interruptions, etc. And these adaptations themselves are always approximations. They're never precise, because perfect information for us to instantiate those approximations is rarely available. Most of the time, these approximations work well. We get away with it. People compensate effectively, but occasionally appropriate adjustments miss the mark, leading to failures. Imagine a nurse who's administering medication in a busy ward. The patient chart is smudged and the barcode scanner battery is low. The nurse, she's under pressure, cross-checks dosage with her memory. It was only an hour ago, so why would it be changed? And a colleague, what do you think? That's fine, move on, she says. Usually, the approximation works and is fine, and the patient receives the correct medication. Sometimes, the adaptation misses the mark. There is a dosage error, and then there's a subsequent adverse event. The key principle to FRAM is functional resonance. That is, variability in one function can amplify or dampen another, much like resonance in a physical system. These variabilities can combine unintentionally to produce amplified and emergent effects. The resonance emerges from how the system normally functions, not necessarily failure, not random chance. It reflects acceptable internal behavior, not noise. Functional resonance is formally defined as detectable performance variability that emerges when multiple approximate adjustments coincide. Think about resonance in physics. Imagine a bridge shaking in the wind that happens to match the natural frequency of the resonance of that bridge. FRAM uses that metaphor to explain how normal variability in different functions can line up and amplify, creating an accident pathway that previously didn't exist. It's not random chance. It's the system doing what it normally does, just aligning in a very unfortunate way. The final principle is we will have outcomes that will emerge as a consequence of this variability. Subsequent events and outcomes result from everyday performance adjustments, not necessarily discrete malfunctions. The variability of performance is usually not large enough on its own to be called a failure, and not sufficient enough alone to cause an effect or an error or a hazard. When multiple small variations interact, they can combine in unexpected ways with nonlinear and sometimes disproportionate outcomes. So both acceptable and unacceptable outcomes can emerge from the same underlying system behavior. FRAM focuses on emergent properties, the interactions between systems, and system-wide variability. So, we're a quarter of the way through this presentation. I'd like you to pause, go away and make yourself a cup of tea, because doing that will be quite significant. We've reflected on the principles, we've considered the equivalence of success and failure, we've accepted that approximate adjustments are normal, and we begin to understand the amplification and dampening of interactions of variables, and we began to consider anticipating outcomes that can emerge from that resonance. So let's get procedural and look at the method, but don't forget to make your cup of tea. The method. FRAM has 4 broad steps. First, we identify and describe the important system functions and its associated aspects. Then we categorize how each one may vary. Next, we look for possible resonance, how variability in one place can ripple through to others. Finally, we develop recommendations that either dampen dangerous variability or support helpful variability. Let's have a look at some of the detail to help you build your first FRAM model. Step 1 is about breaking the system into functions, things that the system has to do to reach its goals. These are best phrased as verb-noun pairs like boil water, add tea bag. This will give us a functional view of the system. Functions represent the means that are necessary to achieve a specific goal. More generally, it represents the acts or the activities, they could be simple or composite, that are needed to produce a certain result. A general rule for the use of FRAM is that a function should be described by a verb, normally a verb phrase, and verb-noun pair. So, for example, diagnose a patient, or boil the water. Okay, making a cup of tea during the interval should have been useful, because here are the functions that I've identified while I'd made my cup of tea in undertaking the universal art of making a cup of tea for Barry. I filled the kettle, I boiled the water, I added tea bag to a cup, I poured the boiling water into the cup, I steeped my tea bag in the cup, I removed my tea bag from the cup, I then added milk, and I stirred, and then I served it to myself. Now, let's not get bogged down about whether that is how you would make a cup of tea. That's part of FRAM. But it's how I've decided I'm going to be making a cup of tea for the purpose of this analysis. In FRAM, each of the functions can be described using up to 6 aspects. You've got inputs, outputs, preconditions, resources, controls, and time. Don't worry, you won't need all 6. The idea is to capture what matters in your context. For example, boiling water needs the kettle as a resource, power as a precondition, or maybe a resource as well, and time to reach boiling. These aspects are what allow us to figure out how a function connects to other functions. You're not required to define all six aspects for every function. Aspects should only be included if they are relevant or useful, or based upon your domain, your specific domain knowledge, the context of the text, and your analytical judgment. FRAM models are expected to be flexible and iterative. Aspects can be added or removed at any stage during the analysis. The model should evolve with your and the team's understanding. And multiple entries of aspects are allowed. A function may have one output used by several downstream functions, multiple outputs going to different parts of the system, multiple inputs, preconditions, controls, etc. from different upstream sources. All 5 non-output aspects, their input, precondition, resource, control, and time, may have 2 or more upstream couplings. The final decision depends upon the analysis and the analysis team. The modeling team decides which aspects are the most significant, and you'll do that based upon experience with the process, relevance of the analysis, and what adds meaningful insight. Inputs. Well, what a function uses or transforms to produce an output. That's what an input is. It can also mean, however, what activates or starts the function. It could be clearance, instruction, or a command to begin, or a signal for a function to start acting. Input is typically expressed as a noun or noun phrase describing a thing or a state. Be careful. Except in boundary cases, every input to a function must also be an output from another function. Inputs cannot arise from nowhere. They're always logically coupled within the system, except if it's a boundary. Outputs of a function describe the result of what the function does. It describes a change in state, as change in state of the system, or one or more of the output parameters. It may be the signal to start another function. The description of an output should be a noun or a noun phrase. The output of boiling water is, well, boiled water. An output from one function must clearly also define as either as an input, a precondition, a resource, a control, or time to another function. Outputs cannot be left dangling. They must end somewhere. Precondition. A precondition is a required system state that must exist before a function can begin. It must be true or verified before execution. But be careful, it does not trigger that function. In contrast, an input both provides information and material that can activate the function. A precondition doesn't. This distinction helps us clarify modeling. It's actually not that critical, as long as dependency is captured. Like inputs, preconditions must also be outputs from other functions. They can't appear as if by magic. Preconditions should be in the form of a noun or a noun phrase. Well, the precondition of boiled water is the water is filled between recommended levels, say. Resource. A resource is something required during the execution of a function. There are 2 types of resource that I can perceive: consumed resources and execution condition resources. Consumed resources are, well, consumed during the function, for example, money or energy. Execution conditions, well, they're not consumed. They just need to exist during the function's execution, for example, human competence that's required to perform this particular task. Like inputs and preconditions, resources must also be outputs to another function. They do not arise independently. Resource descriptions should be noun-based or noun-based phrases. Resource need to boil water, electricity. Controls. Controls regulate or supervise a function to ensure it produces the intended output. They can take many formal forms, such as plans, schedules, procedures, instructions, algorithms, or feedback loops. There are two types of control. External social control, which comes from others' expectations as standards, managers, colleagues, policies, standard operating procedures. They can be formal, written, or informal. There could be cultural norms. There are also internal social controls, which comes from self-regulation or internalized expectations. Like inputs, preconditions and resources, controls must come from somewhere. They should be defined as outputs of other functions, not assumed to appear on their own. For boiling water, our control may be, well, target temperature reached, defined by a thermostat. Time is clearly a significant impact. It reflects how temporal relationship affects a function's performance or sequencing. It can represent an order or a sequence before, after parallel, a particular clock time, 10:30 a.m., and a lapse time within 5 minutes. Now, time clearly has conflicts and relationships with other aspects. Time can be perceived as a control when it governs the order or timing between functions. Time can be perceived as a resource when a task must finish within a particular limit. Time can be seen as a precondition when a task must not start until a certain time or another task is completed. However, in FRAM, time is seen as a distinct aspect. Because time plays multiple roles and influences all other aspects, it's given its own special status in FRAM. Like other aspects, time dependencies must originate from somewhere. They should be outputs from another function. Let's have a look at a very early FRAM analysis. I've identified two specific FRAM functions: boil water, pour boiling water. And as you can see, I have the output of boil water as the input to pour boiling water. I've also considered some of the other aspects of boiled water that will affect and influence its behavior. During your creation of your FRAM model, your FRAM model needs to grow a function at a time. Don't try to do it top down. Try to do it using a natural inside out process. Couplings are significant, and we need to put them to one side and discuss them. Couplings occur when two functions share a common aspect value, e.g. the output of one is the input of another, or the precondition or the control of another function. FRAM does not connect functions directly. It connects their aspects together. These connections are indirect and based upon naming conventions, both representing, so the connection between boiling water and pouring boiled water is boiled water. A coupling implies potential influence, not an actual execution order. That's defined by instantiations, as we'll see later. There are types and properties of couplings. Couplings are typically many-to-many. One function's output may serve as a precondition or control for several other functions. The same aspect, for example, boiled water, can appear in multiple functions with different roles, an input to one, a control in another. Let's have a look at our tea making example and discuss the couplings. If F1 function, boiled water, outputs boiled water, and F3, pour water, has boiled water as its input, then these two functions are coupling used that shared aspect. Let's consider F2, not a tea bag. It must be completed before F3, that's pour water. So F2 might output tea bag in cup, which becomes a precondition for F3. F1's output, which is the kettle, which is in this case a hot kettle, could also serve as a control for F3, ensuring pouring only occurs at the correct temperature. That's another type of coupling. F4, steep tea, may depend upon both the output of the water in the cup with the bag and the timing condition from a control function, say like F9, set timer, leading to multiple couplings. F8, stir and serve, might have all ingredients added as a precondition, which is a combined output from F6, which is add milk, and F7, which is add sugar. So we're halfway through now. Time for another tea break. This FRAM model is one of many that you will find in multiple case study papers. What I want you to do is stop at this point and analyze in detail this model. I want you to identify points of divergence from what you would have created, your interpretation of making a cup of tea. When you're back from your tea break, we're going to reflect on how to use this model to do it further analysis. Enjoy your break. I hope you enjoyed your second cup of tea. Step 1 was modelling the system. That's behind us. Step 2, what we're now going to worry about is we're going to go in search of and consider variability. So while we're focusing on variability, let's remind ourselves. The goal is to understand how functions couples can lead to unexpected outputs. FRAM focuses on the variability of outputs, not just the function itself. Focusing on outputs alone helps us control the complexity in the surface area of the variabilities we will need to consider. If a function varies, but its output doesn't, the variability is considered non-impactful. If the output varies, the function's variability becomes significant to examine. There are three sources of output variability. Internal variability. This comes from the inherent nature or design of the function itself. For example, a natural variation in how a person performs a task. Then we might have external variability. This is caused by the environment or the context in which the function operates. For example, changes in lighting, noise in the environment, the workspace layout. Then we also need to consider upstream and downstream coupling. Variability arises due to inputs or conditions provided by upstream functions. This, as we'll see later, is the basis for functional resonance, where small variations combine and amplify. The reality is mixed causes are common. In practice, output variability will result from a combination of internal factors, external factors, and coupled dependencies. So, one of the things that Eric points out to us, and this is where I think myself and Eric may not totally agree, but this is his approach. Eric identifies three specific types. There are technology functions. These are performed by machines or IT systems. They're assumed to be predictable and reliable by design. FRAM treats technological functions as having minimal or no variability unless evidence suggests otherwise. Maybe. They can vary, but variability is not assumed by default. Fair enough. Human functions. These are performed by individuals or small groups. They're assumed to have high frequency and high amplitude variability. What do we mean by high frequency? Well, people adjust rapidly, often in real time. High amplitude. Performance can vary significantly, both good and bad. And variability influenced by context, stress, experience, communication, etc. Then there's organizational functions. These are performed by structured groups, often large teams or departments. They operate at a systems level, not just individual actions. They're assumed to have low frequency. Organizational change is slow. Yeah, it is. High amplitude. When changes occur, their impact can be significant. Variability often relates to policies, culture, coordination, and strategic direction and decisions. In order to identify, define, and describe how variability appears in a function, or more importantly, a function output, it's crucial for us to detect or observe this variability and to understand how it can affect downstream functions. There are two ways to describe and define variability. There are simple descriptions and there are detailed descriptions. Simple descriptions, that's the recommended starting point, focuses on two key issues: time and precision. Detailed descriptions for a further deeper analysis gets us to explore a broader set of dimensions such as direction and sequence. To stimulate our understanding of variability, it's acceptable to use HAZOP-like guide words that's going to stimulate your search. For example, an output may occur on time, too early, too late, not at all. That's equivalent to an extreme delay or omission. Timing issues can often lead to increased variability in downstream functions, so they're clearly significant. Precision-based guide words. A function's output can be precise, it meets the downstream needs exactly. A function's output could be acceptable. It changes but does not increase variability. It's usable but with adjustments. An output could be imprecise, that is, it could be incomplete, it could be ambiguous, or simply incorrect. An output could require a different additional effort to be interpreted, to fix, or to increase downstream variability. If this simple first phase definition of variability doesn't appear to be satisfactory for that particular function, if required, we can amplify our analysis by investigating detailed variabilities. And variability can manifest its ways well beyond time and precision. We can dive further into time and precision if we want, so we could say too early or too late. We could say duration, too short or too long. But we can also think about strength, distance, direction, and target. Strength could be weak or strong. Distance could be too far, too close. Direction could be the wrong direction, and the target could be the wrong item or who's going to be receiving it. We can also consider variability of sequence, incorrect order, or the steps of the steps or subtask. So, we've completed stage 2, step 2. We have a set of variabilities for each function that we're particularly focusing in on. What we now need to do is undertake step 3, which is look at how that variability might resonate across the system. Why not have a break, have a sip of your tea, and come back? The key to step 3 is our acceptance of how to bring our FRAM model to life, how to execute it conceptually. And we're going to do that by creating instantiations. Instantiations are execution paths that describe what actually happens. Remember, a FRAM model defines potential couplings, not fixed flows. In any specific run or scenario, only some of these couplings will be realized based upon the timing, the condition, and the performance. Once realized, these couplings are then frozen for that particular scenario. Make a cup of tea specifically for Barry, and you only have 3 minutes. So this event-based analysis, you trace what couplings did occur in a prospective analysis and also explore what could occur. So stage 3 will require you to move through investigating single variability, considering coupled variability, and then searching for resonance pathways. Single variability, a function varies in timing or precision. Coupled variability, that's a variability that explicitly affects another function through a defined aspect. And then resonance pathways. You're beginning to identify several variabilities that align and are amplifying into an emergent outcome. So, how do we do this? Step 1 is to select a function to focus in on. Choose one foreground function from the FRAM model and review its set of variabilities that you identified in stage 2. Identify the couplings for that function. List which other functions are directly connected to this particular function via inputs, outputs, preconditions, resources, or controls. These define the immediate pathways for the variability to spread. Trace upstream variability. Look at how variability from upstream functions may influence the function that you're currently in focus. For example, late kettle boiling. which will affect the pouring of water. Trace downstream effects. Consider how variability in a function in focus may propagate downstream to other functions. For example, overfill the cup may affect your stir and serve, so risk of spill might occur. Then you need to explore combinations, that's resonance. Ask, could multiple small variations align or interact to create a bigger effect? Look for resonant pathways, that's chains of variability that link to create linking multiple functions. For example, let's imagine we are allowing a ferry to leave a particular port. So imagine a slightly late ballast retrim, a skipped water tightness check, an absence of an alarm. That may or may not lead to a catastrophic ferry instability. Then we're going to undertake some soft risk analysis by assessing the likelihood and what Eric refers to as the sensitivity of this variability. Is the variability occasional, frequent, or rare? Is the coupling tight, direct, or sensitive? Is it loose, or is it buffered through another function? This will help us prioritize which pathways matter the most. And subsequently, you need to document the significant resonance pathways. Capture each pathway in a clear narrative or a separate diagram, show initiating variability, propagation, and potential outcome, and this will set the stage for stage 4, which is managing and controlling the variability. One of the problems that I had, and I want to share with you, is where to start. And so this is very Barry specific guidance. What I want you to do is start from a known hazard, a known event, or a known outcome of interest. Start in an obvious place. Anchor your analysis in a particular scenario that you care about. The ship failed to close the bow doors. Or there's a possibility I could spill some tea during pouring. Then ask which functions are most directly related to that outcome. Those are going to be your priority candidates, which you're going to focus in on. You might want to map the immediate foreground functions. Identify the functions that directly generate variability in that outcome. For example, pour boiling water in tea making, or verify watertight integrity in a ferry case. I also want you to actually focus in on critical couplings, not just the functions. Look at functions with multiple couplings. They connect to many. They're the places of highest complexity. They're going to act as the hubs where variability can spread. See, these are often the rich candidates to start to go in search of resonance analysis. Also go in search of clearly sensitive functions. Functions where small changes will have the largest consequence because of multiple tight coupling and because of little buffering. For example, the ballast trim on a ship, or medication dosage in healthcare. Then I want you to prioritize based upon the variability richness. Functions with a high potential variability, normally human-based ones, are worth focusing on first. Stable or background functions, normally technical ones, can often be left to one side until you specifically need to suspect them. I need you to be patient. I need you to be iterative. It's like unpeeling an onion. Start with the most obvious functions. Then as you trace the variability propagation, you may then discover, you'll learn more, and you'll bring in new upstream and downstream functions, which you then need to analyze. You don't need to decide the sequence up front. Function selection will evolve innately during your analysis. So, we have completed steps 1, 2, and 3. We're now about to wrap it up. So pause again, stir your tea, maybe put some sugar in it, and let's think about developing recommendations on how we're going to monitor and manage the variability that you've identified. So once you've mapped the resonance in step 3, step 4 is about action. Sometimes you may want to dampen your variability, like make sure there's a fill to mark on your kettle so you prevent it from overfilling. Other times you might want to support good variability, like encouraging the use of a timer for steeping tea. The point isn't to eliminate variability, because that might not be possible. It may be what we can do is manage it and mitigate it. The relationship between step 3 and step 4 can be defined of stage 3 shows us where the variability resonates, and stage 4 specifies what we need to do about it. Think of stage 3 as the diagnosis, identifying patterns of coupling and resonance, and stage 4 as the treatment plan, how to manage variability in practice. Implementing stage 4 will require you to review each resonance pathway that you've identified in stage 3. Where does the variability combine in a harmful way? Where could small adjustments stop it from propagating? Identify leading indicators. What signals would warn you that the variability is drifting towards resonance? For example, the cup constantly is filled to the brim, or I'm frequently requiring kettle refills. Formulate safety constraints. Shall statements that define acceptable boundaries should be defined. For example, cups shall not be filled above 10 millimeters from the rim. Propose dampeners, controls, or enhancers. Consider barriers, tools, procedures, cues, or cultural habits. Some may attenuate unreduced spread. Some may enhance, encourage adaptation. What you'll also need to do is ensure that this analysis maps back to the functions. Ensure each recommendation clearly ties to the functions and the variables that you identified in stage 3. Let's recap. We've said hello to FRAM. It was developed by Eric Hogarnell, I hope I said that correctly, in 2004. It focuses on everyday work and how it's actually performed. That is, work as done. It examines variability in systems and how this can resonate to produce both success and failure. It emphasizes that success and failure stem from the same process, so it doesn't perceive the fault as being the starting point for any incidents. So to summarize, FRAM is about recognizing everyday variability, seeing how it can amplify across functions, and then managing it. If we compare this to HAZOP or STPA, which you may subsequently meet, it's especially useful for socio-technical systems where people's adaptations and their interactions with technical systems really matter. Finally, here's a video, here's a link to a video I'd like you to watch. I'd like you to see FRAM explained by another. It's always helpful to hear the same thing from different voices. What's really valuable is this video concludes with references to useful tools that you may want to investigate. I've not had a brilliant journey with those tools. Maybe you will. On Blackboard, you'll find my complete FRAM analysis of making a cup of tea. Have a look. Add value to it, question it, but most of all, understand the FRAM analysis of the tea so you can then move forwards, because the assignment for this course will require you to undertake a complete FRAM analysis of a system for which you are an important stakeholder, the university assessment process.